Hello, and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Carrie Williams, Associate Director of Alumni Events at York University, and want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you in the audience today. Whether it's your first Scholars Hub or you've been with us since April, thank you and welcome. This webinar is part of our Scholars Hub speaker series. It features timely, relevant, current lectures by academics and researchers from York. And we're so pleased to be able to bring this series online to allow even more alumni to hear from some of the university's leading scholars. We'd like to share with you about a very timely discussion we had at last week's Scholars Hub at Home. It was called, Will This Be the One? Reflection, Engagement, and Action Against Anti-Black Racism in Ontario. If you haven't watched it already, we really encourage you to do so. It was very well attended and just highly relevant and helpful. You can watch it on our YouTube channel. Just visit youtube.com/YorkUalumni. And as a follow-up, this Friday, we'll be hosting a follow-up to that session called Reflection, Engagement, and Action Against Anti-Black Racism in Ontario, Part 2. It's taking place live at 12 noon this Friday. We hope to see you there. Although we aren't all in the same location, we recognize many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. We'd now like to get to know our audience by taking a quick poll, just asking if you've ever attended a York event other than this one right now. The questions should pop up on your screen, and I'll give everybody a moment to respond. Okay. Great. So we have, the majority of you have been with us before with 25% not. So thank you so much for sharing that. It's really helpful for us to understand who's in the audience. It's great to have so many new participants. And for those of you who have joined us before, as always, welcome back. If you are new to this event or new to online events, please know that we are here to support you. If at any point you need help, please just click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and the team is ready there to help you. Use that same button to submit questions for our speaker, as we will have a Q&A period following the talk. And for those of you who are watching live on Facebook, welcome as well. Feel free to submit any questions or comments you have through the comment section of the video, and the team will send them my way. So today's talk is titled Vaccine Geopolitics During a Global Pandemic, featuring Jennifer M. Heineman, professor in the Department of Geography and Social Science and resident scholar at the Center for Refugee Studies. Dr. Heineman is professor and resident scholar at the Center for Refugee Studies, where she was director from 2013 to 2019. Her research focuses on the geopolitics of forced migration and refugee camps, humanitarian responses to displacement, and refugee settlement in North America. Current projects focus on private sponsorship, the social determinants of well-being among newcomers, and the politics of intersectionality in refugee reception contexts. Welcome, Dr. Heineman. It's a pleasure to have you today. I don't see you yet on the screen. There you are. Wonderful. It's so wonderful to have you with us here today. Welcome.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Carrie.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully it will appear to you. This is a talk. This is not the talk I was invited to give. I was invited to speak to you today about refugee newcomers to Canada and how they are coping with COVID-19. However, there is a project at York led by Professor Michaela Hinia, which is studying at this very moment that very question. And it's a research team I happen to have the good fortune to be on as well. And this is looking at Syrians who came to Canada in 2015. So stay tuned. Perhaps that will be another talk for another day. I want to, as I'm a geographer, so I'm a social scientist, I'm not a health researcher. I'm going to put that up on the table before we start. But I'd like to talk about something that is I think, timely, the kind of race for a vaccine. We all, I think, are getting, at least I'll speak for myself, impatient, looking and hoping for things to change so that we can return to some kind of, albeit new, normal. So I want to start with that talk, and oopsie daisy, I just get my, there we go. Oh my goodness. Okay, so I want to start with a different topic, which is vaccine geopolitics, but it also builds on my previous research history. So in 2011, I wrote this book called Dual Disasters, essentially looking at the ways in which two humanitarian emergencies might come together and create an even worse, or at least a different kind of disaster or crisis to deal with. And in my work, I was looking at the impact of war, how it displaced people, and then how the 2004 tsunami came along and displaced people who'd already been affected by war yet again in a different way. So how can different humanitarian or emergencies of any kind come together, and what impact does that have on geopolitics? So let's move to the moment. Since I came up with this title, which is now a little bit outdated, we have had another pandemic highlighted for us. And this picture is from Minnesota. It's a protest of the anti-Black racism against police violence. And this has all occurred within the last month, of course. The sign there that you can see on the slides, racism is a pandemic too. And I think we can't help but think in this moment, and I have not yet seen the webinar with Professor Anucha's talk, and I look forward to the Friday talk. But I think we can't not understand racism as a public health concern, more than a concern, an urgent, in this case, pandemic. So we've got, in a sense, dual disasters, the pandemic of COVID, the pandemic of anti-Black racism and police violence as a response to think about here. So that I'm trying to introduce that piece. I think it's important to be accountable to what is happening to us today. And I think just one last point, I think the protest politics require us to come together and to push back against violence. And yet we're also being asked to social distance at the same time. So as a geographer, these very different spatialities of response contradict one another and give us much food for thought. I want to briefly look at something that Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations in the US, recently said, and that is in the wake of George Floyd's death, he was interviewed as saying the US is divided, diminished, and distracted, by which he meant that in many respects, sorry, just getting the slides to work. The US in particular was preoccupied with domestic concerns, rightly so, unprecedented protests, unprecedented levels of infection in that country. But its role as a superpower was being neglected. And Haass was quick to point out that these were geopolitical gifts to countries like China and Russia. And so one example might be the World Health Organization. We know that Trump said, we're gonna pull our money and we're gonna pull out of the World Health Organization. And this left a geopolitical vacuum, which China was all too happy to step into. But a second problem with that move is that there are very few international or global organizations that can help coordinate, share information, share best practices, and come up with an international or global response. So in withdrawing from that, we also have a geopolitical issue. Returning for a moment to the notion of pandemics and of racism and of power relations that shape the COVID-19 expression at this exact moment, I just want to say that while we're all threatened or at least put at risk by this virus, pandemics are not truly democratic. They may affect us all, but they're highly raced, classed. They follow the fault lines of inequalities that pre-exist, in this case, the virus. And I think if we look at this map, as a geographer, I should have a legend and other things, but I've borrowed this from Global News. They used it recently online. And it's a map of the Greater Toronto Area. You'll notice that the darker areas are more affected than the lighter ones. And those happen to be areas where people experience higher levels of poverty. People are living much more close together. People are, sharing elevators, living in dense and vertical neighborhoods without necessarily as much space as they would want. And I'm thinking here of newcomers to Canada who have a very modest stipend to find housing, which is never enough to pay for all the bills that must be met. So we see that the Northeast and specifically the Northwest, including the York Heights area, has been much more affected. This is a June 7th map. Things are getting better, which is always good. But just to say that pandemics are not truly democratic. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I want to quickly run through what I hope to cover. I want to show you that we have a globalized pandemic, and I want to talk about what is globalization for just a minute as part of that. But our responses are disorganized, not always very coordinated, and in many cases distinctly national, if not nationalistic. And I want to show how that affects the race for vaccines. So in this vaccine race, which isn't to say I don't think it's akin to an arms race because it's not militarized, but there is a lot of competition among nations to produce the new vaccine. And I think we're all very excited about somebody being successful. But I want to also consider how these geopolitics, how this competition among states is thickening our borders and affecting our mobility. Again, many of us are perhaps wondering if we will be taking summer holidays, and if so, where and when. And so what is vaccine geopolitics? I'm going to answer that as we go through the talk, but I think there's an interesting example. Chinese billionaire Hui Ka-yan, he made a challenge. He's a wealthy man. He offered $115 million to two different research institutes. One is the Harvard Medical School, and the other was the Guangzhou Institute of Respiratory Diseases. So these two groups were supposed to split the money and, I guess, race for the vaccine. At Harvard, Dr. Dan Baruch is quoted as saying this, quote, "We are not racing against each other, we are racing the virus." And Baruch goes on to say, he's the director of virology at Harvard, "What we need is a global vaccine because an outbreak in one part of the world puts the rest of the world at risk. Common sense, perhaps self-evident, but in a truly globalized world that's connected in so many ways, that we would revert to national responses is on the one hand, common sense, and on the other hand, insufficient. Common sense because a government is responsible to its citizens, to its voters, to its people, and all those who live on its territory. But it's insufficient in the sense that best practices and what one country decides is not necessarily what another country decides. So how can they harmonize their borders without common practices or common approaches? So let's take a look at that. In a global pandemic, how will a race for the vaccine work, or will it? And who will get the vaccine first? So let's look practically. And again, I'm not a health researcher, but as a public intellectual, I've gathered some data for you. This is from the Times, the New York Times, a couple of weeks ago. Herd immunity is a term I'm still grappling with. it applies to humans, but it does somehow seem like cattle or something to me still. But what it means is that you need a minimum of 60% up to 80% of a population needs to have the antibodies against a virus for that population to be basically not susceptible to spread and outbreak. And the data to the right show the cities hardest hit with good data available during the COVID-19 pandemic. So New York City, the highest people there, 20% of the population has antibodies. In London, it's slightly lower with 17.5%. Madrid, 11%, returning workers in Wuhan, 10, all the way down to Stockholm and Barcelona. Hard hit cities, but with only 7% of the inhabitants having antibodies. So in short, nobody is close to having herd immunity or basically a sufficient proportion of the population to stop the spread. Timing on the vaccine is unclear. Everything I've read suggests people are hopeful that 12 to 18 months will be possible, but we know that the fastest vaccine ever developed was for the mumps in the 60s, and that was 4 years. So there are real sort of examples that give us pause to think about how long it could be. Of course, other treatments are possible too. Hopefully we can come back to some of this at the Q&A. So ever so briefly, I want to talk about globalization because it's not something to be for or against. It is something that connects us all. And time-space compression is simply a term that geographers have come up with in a sense to explain and show how we have become functionally integrated, economically speaking, socially speaking. Families are often spread across borders, and how we are connected. 1.4 billion people took flights in 2019. That's an astounding number. Of course, the number will be much lower in 2020. But essentially, air travel, containerization, which is simply the use of containers from a production site in Shenzhen, production zone in China, things are put into a container, and that same container gets onto a ship, it gets onto a train, and it gets onto a truck and arrives at the dollar store in, Oshawa, let's just say. So because of technology, both internet, obviously airplane technologies, containerization, we are more integrated and kind of seamless globally than ever before. Financialization is all obviously globalized as well. But what concerns us here is that COVID is hopping on the backs of those 1.4 billion people, not that many this year, but is essentially able to spread globally. So without a global response, we are in a slightly compromised position, I would argue. Just for fun, we have an Economist cover, which gets at this notion of goodbye globalization. What I want to build on here is that we have this Balkanization, this breaking up of the world into countries and into this kind of competitive geopolitics. On the one hand, it's common sense because our healthcare is nationalized, or in the case of Canada, it's actually managed at a provincial level, and even district-driven directives. Here in the Greater Toronto area, you can tell we have yet to we're not allowed to have haircuts yet. I'm very much looking forward to that day. But we are also in lockdown a little bit longer than the rest of Ontario because of our numbers, including other places like Windsor, Essex County, share numbers that are just not quite as low as they need to be for us to open up. So all of the levels of response are much finer scales of response to something which is globalized, and that is a bit of a problem. Let's look for a moment at travel restrictions. The European Union I'm going to use it as an example because on Monday, Europe opened up for the summer insofar as Europe is going to open up. The EU is perhaps the most integrated region in the world. It shares a currency. Workers, people, citizens are allowed to cross borders for the purpose of work. It is highly integrated and has worked quite well as a region for a long time. But the patchwork of travel restrictions is a little bit dizzying, and I invite you to think about a trip to Europe if you had this summer, for example. Iceland will welcome you with a mandatory quarantine period, but without a mandatory quarantine period, but you have to take a COVID test on arrival. So that is one approach. And as far as I can tell, that's the only country, outside of the EU, I should add, that has the COVID test on arrival. Ireland and Britain never closed their borders, but both will require you to quarantine for 14 days if you're to go. And here my main point is that borders are reconfigured based on health status. So not only is your passport important, but your health status, and perhaps in the future, an immunity passport may become important. Denmark, in stark contrast, allows only people from Norway, Iceland, and Germany to visit. Sweden and the Netherlands are on the no-go list for a lot of European countries because of their very open approach to managing COVID-19. In Sweden, as many of you will know, the schools were not closed, many businesses were not closed, and so Denmark is keeping a very running a very tight ship in terms of who gets on. In Portugal, in contrast, the opposite. Portugal seems to be open to the world. Among countries that are allowed to fly there, Canada, the US, Brazil, Venezuela, the Lusophone countries, which makes it a very interesting outlier in the European context. I won't go through too many countries. One last one in case you're thinking of going to Santorini. Greece has drawn up a list of 28 countries based on what's called the ESA list, which is the EU aviation safety list of low transmission spots. It goes airport by airport, actually, but neither the US nor Canada is on that list. So that patchwork of you can come, you can't come, for the most part, Canada and the US are not that welcome in the EU itself. This brings me to the topic of bubbles and travel bubbles, and I really can't spend too much time on this, as interesting as it is, but we've heard countries like Australia, New Zealand talk about forming a bubble where you could fly back and forth, but we don't want to have international flights from other places yet. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia have formed one of these as well. And the question for Canadians is, might we form a bubble with the US? I think the answer is not yet. We know the border is closed at least until July 21st. Another version of these bubbles is one that can happen on a finer scale, like regional bubbles such as the Atlantic bubble, which has been proposed. The Atlantic provinces, that is, may well bubble with each other and keep those Torontonians out for the summer at least. And certainly my flight to Newfoundland was canceled. I'm still hopeful, but I think I might be dreaming. But bubbles are another response. And of course, we've been living these bubbles in our own personal lives, which I'll get to in just a minute. Last month, Dr. Stephen Hoffman presented in this space, and his point was to say, we don't necessarily need to close the border, but what we do need to do is ensure, monitor, and enforce a 14-day quarantine for all who cross it. And I think this is a very interesting point because we know that non-essential traffic cannot come across the border at the moment, but essential traffic is coming across, and hopefully in a safe and orderly manner. So as noted, just as international borders are being reconfigured to consider health, so too are the personal borders around us. Social distancing, mask wearing, hand washing, these are all very mundane activities, but at the scale of the body, these are a means of managing one's own personal borders and wellness. Many years ago now, I wrote about the body in the case of warfare as the finest scale of political space, and civilians in war are often the targets of bullets, but also of violence, such as rape as a tactic of war, starvation camps for men so they cannot fight in war, and other types of very specific and finely focused violence. Obviously not something we want to have to talk too much about, but I think it's relevant here. The politics of face masks. It's kind of alarming that to the south of us, face masks signal ideological, geographical, and even political party divides that are so so strong, people will not wear a face mask because it might signal that they are of a particular persuasion politically or otherwise. And really, I think we can all, at least I would put forth the idea that if there's scientific evidence that wearing masks reduces infection, I think governments can mandate it. But let's see what you all have to say about that. This is a picture I took of Trinity Bellwoods Park a couple of weeks ago when they painted the little lines on the grass because people were not social distancing very well. I walked through there last night. In fact, people were sitting in the little circles, so that's good news. But again, this is to conjure this notion of the personal borders, which have become so important. And for most of us, you know, these borders are an unfortunate symptom of the current moment of the pandemic. So where does this take us? Globalization plus COVID minus international cooperation, Balkanization is where we're at. Vaccine geopolitics points to the competition among states to cure COVID-19, but also a shift in the meaning and operation of international borders. I just wanted to say a word or two about the vaccine geopolitics as we've heard about them. In the US, we've heard from the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, who said, you know, quote, putting aside commercial value, there would be great geopolitical significance to being the first to develop a treatment or a vaccine. We will use all the tools we have to safeguard American research, which is a puzzling comment, but an interesting one. We find the scientists and the doctors on one side talking about a global vaccine, and on the other side, we have the politicians as well as the civil servants, national leaders emphasizing immunizing their own populations first. And here I'm speaking of Trump. In March, many of you will remember he approached a German biotech company that was quickly developing or in the process of working on a vaccine and asking if A, the US could acquire that company, B, if it could move to the US, and most importantly, would the company, if it developed the vaccine, be willing to provide vaccines to Americans first? And needless to say, the company declined the offer and did not agree to putting Americans first. So I think that's a piece of the geopolitics, vaccine geopolitics puzzle. We know, and this is just out of The Guardian, as long as the infection rages in one country, all other nations are at risk. And we know that it's sort of self-evident, but important to remember. Globalization means we're all in this together, if not equally so. This quote comes from Margaret Hamburg, and we're getting to the end of the talk here. She's the Foreign Secretary of the National Academy of Medicine, and this was in the New York Times Magazine on the weekend. She says this: I think we need to create systems for assuring fair and equitable and public health-driven distribution of the vaccine once it's created, to avoid what she calls nationalistic push among countries. And that we don't have a system or a plan to roll out the vaccine is telling, and I think important. This is echoed by George Daly, who happens to be the dean of the medical school at Harvard, who says, we shouldn't squander early doses of vaccine on low-risk Americans. He goes on to talk about how high-risk health workers and older adults should be prioritized, stop the spread among them for whom it's most lethal, and then move to the next tier of people who need the vaccine. So that's working across borders. And this is a point that many people, including Professor Anna Triandafilidou, has made in their own work and in different talks. I'm not the first to say it by any means. So let me start to wrap up here by saying that the inequalities that exist in our society before COVID are being magnified by pandemics, and that the fault lines of class, race, nationality are particularly important. The data coming out of countries in the global south, let's say, are uneven and hard to read, but we know that people are suffering hugely in countries like Ecuador and places where the capacity is just not there to treat people once they're sick. Anti-Black racism and violence stemming from it, including police violence, and especially police violence, constitute a pandemic in and of their own right. So we cannot look and think about COVID-19 without thinking about this new layer. And I wasn't going to read this, but I've just decided that I'm going to add it in. This is from Roxane Gay in the New York Times, speaking about anti-Black violence in the context of COVID-19. She says this: eventually doctors will find a coronavirus vaccine, but Black people will continue to wait, despite the futility of hope, for a cure for racism. We live with the knowledge that a hashtag is not a vaccine for white supremacy. We live with the knowledge that no one is coming to save us. The rest of the world yearns to get back to normal. For Black people, normal is the very thing from which we yearn to be free. And that is incredibly sobering and very important for us in this moment to reflect upon and think about. I do want to leave you on a slightly lighter note with a suggestion from one of you in the audience on pandemic fiction. This is a book that I'm currently reading. I haven't got through it yet because I was trying to do too many things at once, as always. But Station 11 is a book, written after SARS, but before COVID-19, in a not too dystopic vein, one that I think we can all learn from as well. So thanks for listening, everyone. I look forward to your questions.
Hello, hi, Dr. Heinemann. Thank you so much for that. So many things sort of racing through my mind as I was listening to you. It's so helpful to have these conversations we've been having on the pandemic, because there's so many perspectives to come at it from. And what you've done is, as a consumer of news, it's been confusing to understand, okay, the Maritimes might do this and the US is doing that. And it's very confusing to understand why that's happening. And just your talk just helped me to understand that, me to understand the politics of something as simple and basic as wearing, and obvious as wearing a mask. It just really, really helpful. And so thank you so much for that. And it also has been confusing to think about, with all of the protests and watching the thousands of people, even seeing, oh my gosh, is anybody, is our masks even going to work in this? And it's just a very confusing time. And so the perspectives you've offered was just really helpful. So thank you for that. We do have some time for questions. We have lots. So we'll start with our first question. So the idea of vaccine geopolitics reminds me of the Cold War. Are we seeing a resurgence of those politics in this moment of COVID-19?
Sadly, yes. There's so many different examples. I think I gave one in the talk, but I think it really has not been helpful south of us for political leadership, namely President Trump, to refer to the virus as the Chinese virus. This virus could have come from any number of places, but there's racism and Cold War geopolitics embedded in that. And I think that is not constructive at all. Getting back to this notion of what are the best practices that we can think about at a global level, and as a group of states and as a group of peoples across the world. I do think that withdrawing from something like the WHO does create a vacuum, and if you're a unilateralist, as President Trump is, you don't necessarily want to be part of NATO. You don't necessarily want to be play nicely with others, and so I do think that bipolarization is continuing, and sadly I can think of other examples, but I'll stop there.
Right. No, thank you for that. Another question. The divisive politics of white supremacy movements and their anti-immigrant rhetoric in the US and Canada predated COVID-19. Is this similar to vaccine geopolitics?
Yes. Well, let's see. So the titled Vaccine Geopolitics, again, was pitched well before the death of George Floyd and before this incredible moment of social and political uproar against police violence, anti-Black police violence specifically. I do think that, getting back to the face mask question, I do think that that has in the US, and again, I don't want to be US centric here, but a number of processes and politics have come to the fore whereby the South, by the US Southeast, the South, as it were, wearing masks is not what real men do, is not what, you know, what Republicans do. It's become far too personalized and far more about politics than about health. And again, they're indivisible. I think I've tried to show that in the talk, but ultimately, any kinds of nationalism can be potentially dangerous. Sometimes they're important and they are about minorities standing up for rights. And they're also they can be racialized politics where people stand up for not just rights, but you know, the right to exist. So any kind of nationalism can be dangerous, and I think we should be on the lookout for those things. But within a context of COVID, you know, there's different layers that we also have to pay attention to.
Thank you. Question from Brian Dobson. If test results are not available immediately, how beneficial are they as what if the person catches COVID-19 the next day? Do you see history books being written in a few years as to what were the various states in the US thinking with the rising cases as they opened up their economies?
Wow. So those are two huge questions. And the first one, I think we have not really figured out the testing regime. Where do you go after your test? You need to be in a safe holding room separate from everyone before you find out the response. And again, those are both technical and I think logistical questions. I know the Hong Kong airport, apparently it takes a good 5 hours to go through the whole process. We know that people who want to visit long-term care homes in Ontario, you know, they have to get a test less than 3 days before they visit for half an hour. So how this is going to all roll out, I'm really not sure. In terms of reopening in the US, wow, that is, you know, I used to live in Arizona, and Arizona reopened on May 15th, and they have seen the highest spike since COVID hit since that time. So I think the reopening question is one. I cut a slide or two out, but there's a magazine cover that's the title is something like "The Grim Calculus Between Life, Death, and the Economy," and I think that captures the equation, the calculus that governments are making and have to make, and it's a terrible decision to have to make, to choose between life and death, to choose between death and the economy. To me, those are choices no one should have to make, but we're having to make them now. And I think I'm a cautious person. I'd like to be living in British Columbia right now, which is the land of Dr. Bonnie Henry and a very solid approach. But I'm quite happy to be living in Toronto and staying in my socially distanced front room as we talk to you right now.
Great, and sharing your wisdom with, you know, almost 100 people right now, which is great. Another question from Keisha Bell Kovas. Is the WHO responsible, the World Health Organization, responsible for coordinating a global vaccine? What about vulnerable countries like Yemen or Venezuela, or countries with large refugee camps?
Great.
Does the World Health Organization determine which countries or regions should receive access to the vaccine first? Very political.
Short answer, no. I wish WHO might have that kind of power, but it does not. I do think that refugee camps, countries like Yemen that are just in unbelievable, sort of facing unbelievable challenges, COVID aside, are in, they're going to have to wait and see, like everyone. But ultimately, geopolitics is about which countries are strongest, which countries have the R&D, the research and development capacity to be testing vaccines. We know that China and Dalhousie University in Halifax are testing one vaccine. AstraZeneca is working with Oxford University to work on another vaccine. Johnson and Johnson and Moderna are working on yet another in the U.S. So those teams are part of, for the most part, wealthy countries that leave out people in refugee situations and certainly war zones themselves, which I think Yemen would be counted as one. So I hate to say it, but I mean, there are good news stories, but at the same time, unfortunately, inequalities that predated COVID will probably be reproduced in the wake of COVID.
Okay, thank you. Another question from the audience. Do you think vaccine geopolitics will mean that immunity passports, in quotes, immunity passports, as mentioned in popular media these days, are inevitable for crossing borders?
I hope not. It seems, already so many biometrics are needed for people to cross borders. To get a visa to come to Canada, you often need to put your fingerprints in, and that's a lot of expense and time and effort. But an immunity passport that you would have to prove that you have immunity, perhaps that's a fair thing to ask. Right now, not nearly enough people do. I think what might be fair, and the question earlier gets to this point, is that perhaps you need to have an immunity, you have to have a COVID test upon arrival, or as Dr. Hoffman said last month, we ensure, and the word ensure is very important here, that people quarantine for 14 days upon arriving back. I read today that at the Alberta border, Americans are crossing, saying they're driving to Alaska, but that there is some evidence that they might really just be on a little Rockies vacation trip. So, how, if at all, is Canada regulating? We're not very good at. We monitor our borders, but it's another thing altogether to do a person by person immunity passport. I hope we don't go there, but it's possible.
Okay. Thank you so much. We have some more questions from the audience, but we're pretty much out of time. Thank you for just making the choice to share that quote. I think that was a great choice. And thanks also, you are the first of our speakers to refer to another speaker from a previous Scholars Hub. So kudos to you for that. And it's a great connection. So far, most of our content has all been about COVID-19 as well. We started on the anti-Black racism last week. So there's lots of crossover, and we are more connected than we are not. So thank you for that. Before we say goodbye to our audience, I want to just first thank you all for taking the time to join us today. We have one last question for you, and should come up on your screen. And the question is, what is your interest in attending Scholars Hub at Home during the summer months? It's just really helpful for us to have this feedback from you. It just helps us to inform how we plan our events going forward and making sure that we're tailoring them to you. So thank you so much for participating in that. Feel free to share today's talk with your friends and family. It will be posted on our social channels. You can follow us at York Alumni on Twitter and Insta. You can also join our LinkedIn group or follow us on Facebook by searching York University Alumni. Feedback about this or any of our programming is welcome and can be sent to us through our social channels or directly by email at alumni@yorku.ca. We have 2 more Scholars Hub at Home events this week. Tomorrow, Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and Friday at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. Tomorrow's lecture is Countermeasures to the Supply Chain Disruptions Associated with COVID-19 in the Long Term. Again, 2 p.m. tomorrow. We originally had Professor Toyosaki on the schedule earlier in the month, but because of some technical difficulties, we've rescheduled till tomorrow. And I'm so pleased that he'll be joining us tomorrow. And then this Friday, June 19th at 12 noon, we'll be hosting the follow-up lecture I mentioned earlier on the conversation and lecture titled Reflection, Engagement, and Action Against Anti-Black Racism in Ontario, Part 2. Associate Professor Anusha and her team at Youth Rex will be delivering that. So that's this Friday at noon. We're expecting a full house for these lectures and really hope that you'll be there as well. Thank you once again to Dr. Heineman and to each of you for attending today. Keep safe and well.